The easiest way to lose everything is to trust the wrong person. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime that sounded almost polite, as if the building itself wanted to pretend nothing was happening. I stepped inside carrying a single black suitcase that held everything I still owned. The polished marble floor reflected my trembling hands, but I refused to let anyone see me cry. 2 security guards stood beside the elevator without looking directly at me. They had greeted me every morning for almost a year. Tonight they couldn't even meet my eyes. I couldn't blame them. Orders were orders. The penthouse was 43 floors above the city, but it already felt like another lifetime. The doors began to close before I heard his voice one last time. Leave. Just one word. Calm. Cold. Final. Adrian Romano never needed to raise his voice. His silence always carried more weight than anyone else's anger. The doors sealed shut between us, and for the first time since I had met him, I disappeared from his world without looking back. My reflection stared at me from the mirrored wall. 26 years old. Blonde hair pulled into a loose knot. Green eyes swollen from holding back tears I refused to let fall inside his home. No, not my home. I reminded myself of that as the elevator descended. It had never been mine. It had always belonged to the man who believed a lie more easily than he believed me. Floor numbers blinked one after another. 42. 41. 40. Every light felt like another piece of my life being erased. I remembered carrying flowers into that elevator on my first day, nervous about redesigning the penthouse for the city's most private billionaire. Nobody had warned me that the owner wasn't just the head of Romano Holdings. Nobody had whispered that Adrian Romano ruled an empire built on loyalty, influence, and secrets people rarely spoke about above a whisper. I had only seen a quiet man standing alone beside a window overlooking Manhattan, watching rain slide across the glass while the skyline glowed beneath storm clouds. Somewhere between choosing paint colors and arguing over antique furniture, we had stopped being strangers. Somewhere between shared dinners that neither of us planned and late nights spent working in comfortable silence, I had started believing I belonged there. Maybe that had been my biggest mistake. The elevator reached the lobby with another gentle chime. Outside, rain painted silver streaks across the enormous glass entrance. The doorman hurried toward me with an umbrella, then slowed, uncertain whether he was still allowed to help. I smiled anyway and shook my head. "I'm okay," I whispered, even though we both knew I wasn't. Cold rain landed on my face the second I stepped onto the sidewalk. Yellow taxi lights blurred through the water gathering in my eyes. Behind me, the skyscraper stretched into the dark sky like a monument built for people who never had to question where they belonged. I pulled my suitcase behind me and started walking with no destination, only distance. I told myself I wasn't leaving my future behind. I was leaving the place where someone had stopped believing in it. I didn't know then that the city wasn't finished with my story. Neither was Adrian Romano. Rain has a way of making every city sound lonely. I walked for what felt like hours, although the glowing clock outside a pharmacy insisted it had only been 38 minutes since I stepped out of that building for the last time. My shoes were soaked through. My suitcase wheels rattled over cracked sidewalks, catching on every uneven piece of concrete as if the city itself wanted to slow me down. I checked my phone out of habit. No messages. No missed calls. Not even a single word asking where I was or whether I had somewhere safe to spend the night. I laughed quietly at myself because a small part of me had expected the impossible. Adrian Romano did not second-guess his decisions. Everyone in Manhattan knew that. I had simply forgotten that one rule did not disappear because I happened to care about the man behind it. The hotel on the corner had rooms that cost more than I could afford for an entire week. The smaller motel 6 blocks away had one vacancy left. I stood beneath the faded neon sign for almost a minute before walking inside. The woman behind the front desk smiled kindly without asking questions. I appreciated that more than she could ever know. She handed me a key card and pointed toward the second floor. The room smelled faintly of fresh laundry and old paint. The furniture did not match. The curtains had been repaired more than once. A tiny coffee maker sat beside a television that probably belonged in another decade. Somehow it felt more honest than the perfect apartment I had just left behind. I placed my suitcase on the bed and finally allowed myself to breathe. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked unfamiliar. Exhaustion had softened every sharp edge in my face. I removed the silver key card that opened the penthouse elevator from my wallet and turned it over between my fingers. Less than 12 hours earlier, it had unlocked one of the most exclusive homes in New York City. Now it was nothing more than a piece of plastic carrying memories that no longer belonged to me. I dropped it into the trash can and listened to the quiet sound it made when it landed. I expected relief. Instead, I felt strangely empty. Sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that single word again. Leave. Not shouted. Not spoken with anger. Just enough certainty to erase months of trust in one heartbeat. Around 3 a.m, I opened my laptop and searched through old emails until I found a message from a small design firm in Brooklyn. They had offered me a position 6 months earlier, but I had politely declined because my life had seemed settled. I stared at the contact information for a long moment before typing a short reply asking whether the opportunity had already been filled. My finger hovered over the send button. If I pressed it, there would be no pretending this was temporary. I would be choosing a new beginning instead of waiting for an apology that might never come. Outside, the rain finally stopped. The silence that followed felt unfamiliar, almost hopeful. I took one slow breath, pressed send, and watched the email disappear into the darkness, never realizing that somewhere across the city, someone else was standing alone beside a window that suddenly felt much larger than it had the night before. The next morning arrived without asking whether I was ready for it. Pale sunlight slipped through the thin motel curtains and painted quiet lines across the carpet. For a few peaceful seconds I forgot where I was. Then I reached toward the empty nightstand expecting to find the familiar cup of coffee that always appeared before sunrise, and my hand closed around nothing but cool air. I sat up slowly and smiled at my own foolishness. Habits take much longer to disappear than people do. My phone vibrated while I was packing the few clothes I had brought with me. My heart raced before I even looked at the screen. It was not Adrian. It was an email notification. The design firm in Brooklyn wanted to schedule an interview that afternoon. I read the message twice just to make sure I had not imagined it. They thanked me for responding and explained that another position had recently opened. Fate had quietly unlocked a door the same night another one had closed. I took the subway instead of calling a taxi. The crowded train smelled like coffee, newspapers, and the beginning of another busy workday. Nobody recognized me. Nobody knew I had spent months living above the skyline in a home that overlooked Central Park. I was simply another woman holding a worn suitcase between her knees, hoping life would be kinder than yesterday. That thought felt strangely comforting. Across Manhattan, another morning unfolded inside the penthouse. Adrian Romano stood where he always stood, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows as sunlight spread across the city below. His assistant placed a fresh cup of black coffee beside him exactly at 7 o'clock. It remained untouched. The silence inside the apartment was different now. It no longer felt peaceful. It echoed. He walked toward the dining room and stopped without understanding why. Only one plate had been prepared, exactly as instructed after I left. The table looked larger than he remembered. The chairs seemed farther apart. He turned toward the bookshelf where a small ceramic lighthouse still rested beside several architecture magazines. I had found it at a neighborhood street market because I thought every home needed one object that served no purpose except making people smile. He had rolled his eyes when I carried it upstairs. Somehow it had never been moved. His hand hovered over it for a brief second before he stepped away. There was work waiting. Meetings. Contracts. Decisions that affected thousands of people. The world expected Adrian Romano to remain precise and unshaken. And he did. Every decision that morning was made with the same calm confidence as always. Every executive left the conference room believing nothing had changed. Yet when the meeting ended, Adrian glanced toward the empty chair beside the windows without realizing why. I was usually there on Thursdays, reviewing renovation sketches or reminding him that offices looked less intimidating with plants. He caught himself looking twice before returning to his paperwork. Meanwhile, I walked into the small Brooklyn design studio carrying nothing except my portfolio and whatever confidence I could still gather. The owner greeted me with a warm handshake instead of cautious respect. She asked about my ideas before asking about my resume. For the first time in weeks, someone looked at me without seeing the shadow of another person's name. I answered every question honestly, never mentioning the penthouse or the man who had quietly become the chapter of my life that I was trying so hard to close. Neither of us knew that the distance growing between our worlds would soon begin pulling us back toward one another in ways neither of us could possibly control. 3 days later, I signed the employment papers with a pen that trembled only once. The office was smaller than any space I had worked in before, tucked above a neighborhood bookstore where the scent of fresh coffee drifted through open windows every morning. There were no marble floors, no private elevators, no city skyline stretching for miles beyond floor-to-ceiling glass. Instead, there were hardwood desks worn smooth by years of honest work, shelves crowded with fabric samples, and co-workers who greeted one another by first name instead of title. It felt wonderfully ordinary. Emily, the owner of the studio, handed me a small brass key with a smile. "Welcome to Bennett and Birch Design." Nobody had welcomed me anywhere in what felt like forever. I slipped the key into my pocket and realized it weighed almost nothing, yet somehow it felt heavier than every luxury access card I had ever carried. My apartment was only 6 blocks away. It measured less than 600 square feet, with a tiny kitchen, a narrow living room, and windows that overlooked a brick wall instead of Central Park. The radiator rattled every evening around 8 o'clock, and the upstairs neighbor practiced the piano just well enough to remind everyone that he was still learning. I loved every imperfect sound. On Saturday morning, I bought 2 inexpensive plants from a neighborhood market and placed them beside the windows. I found a framed watercolor painting at a thrift store for $20 and hung it above the couch. Slowly, quietly, the empty apartment began to feel like mine. Nobody had given it to me. Nobody could take it away with a single sentence. Across the river, Adrian Romano followed the same routine that had guided him for years. Meetings began exactly on schedule. Financial reports were flawless. Investors remained confident. The city continued to see the man who never hesitated. Yet the people closest to him noticed changes too small for anyone else to recognize. His coffee often cooled untouched. Dinner was prepared every evening and quietly removed almost exactly an hour later. The housekeeper asked whether she should store several boxes of decorating materials that still occupied one corner of the library. Adrian looked toward them without speaking for several long seconds before answering. "Leave them where they are." Nobody questioned the decision. They simply nodded and moved on. Late one evening, he entered the living room intending to review contracts, but his attention settled on a knitted blanket folded neatly across the sofa. Claire always insisted expensive homes needed something handmade because perfection without warmth felt like a museum. He remembered teasing her about it. She had laughed and wrapped the blanket around his shoulders anyway while insisting that every successful man secretly liked being comfortable. For reasons he could not explain, he sat down without opening a single file. Silence settled around him once again. At nearly the same hour, I carried a paper bag filled with groceries back to my apartment after work. The cashier wished me a good evening. A little girl outside dropped one of her crayons, and I bent down to return it. Her mother thanked me with an exhausted smile before they continued down the sidewalk hand in hand. Life suddenly felt smaller than it had only a week before, yet somehow it also felt more real. I unlocked my apartment door, stepped inside, and noticed an envelope lying on the floor beneath the mail slot. There was no return address. Only my name, written in neat black ink that I recognized the instant I saw it. My hands hesitated over the envelope for several seconds before I finally opened it. The paper inside was thick, expensive, and carried no signature. There was only one sentence. Some lies survive because the truth arrives too late. I read it again, searching for meaning hidden between the words, but there was nothing else. No explanation. No address. No clue about who had slipped it through my door. A chill traveled down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool evening air drifting through the open kitchen window. I folded the paper carefully and placed it inside my desk drawer. Whoever had sent it wanted me to think about it, and unfortunately they had succeeded. Monday morning arrived with the familiar rhythm of subway breaks, busy sidewalks, and coffee cups balanced in hurried hands. Emily assigned me my first independent project, a small townhouse renovation for a retired couple in Brooklyn Heights. They greeted me with homemade cookies and stories about the family photographs they wanted displayed throughout the house. They did not ask whether I had worked for famous clients. They only wanted someone who listened. By lunchtime I realized I had smiled more that morning than I had during my final month inside the penthouse. Across the East River, Adrian finished reviewing financial reports when his chief of security quietly entered the office carrying a digital tablet. "There is something you should probably see," he said carefully. Adrian accepted the tablet without expression. It displayed security footage from the week before I had left. Hallway cameras. Elevator recordings. Timestamps. Routine files that nobody had considered important until a software update restored several corrupted clips. Adrian watched silently as a familiar executive entered his private office long after everyone else had gone home. 10 minutes later the same man exited carrying a folder that should never have left the room. Adrian frowned. According to every report he had received, I had supposedly removed confidential documents that evening. Yet there I was on another camera nearly 20 minutes later, entering through the front entrance with grocery bags and stopping to chat with the concierge before riding upstairs. The timeline did not fit. It never could have happened the way he had been told. He replayed the footage twice. Then a third time. For the first time since ordering me to leave, certainty gave way to doubt. It was a feeling Adrian Romano disliked more than almost anything else. "Who reviewed this footage originally?" he asked quietly. His security chief shifted uncomfortably before answering. "Ethan Crawford requested the investigation personally." Adrian said nothing. Ethan had been his most trusted operations director for almost 8 years. Loyalty had never seemed questionable. Until now. That evening I stayed late at the studio adjusting lighting plans for the townhouse project. As everyone else packed their bags, Emily stopped beside my desk and smiled. "You have a gift for making spaces feel like home." The words caught me off guard because they reminded me of something Adrian had once said after watching me rearrange an entire room without buying a single new piece of furniture. I thanked her, gathered my sketches, and walked outside into the warm glow of the setting sun. I did not notice the black sedan parked quietly across the street. Inside, a man lowered a pair of binoculars and made a brief phone call. "She has started over," he said calmly. "And she still has no idea what really happened." The strangest part about rebuilding your life is how quickly ordinary moments begin to matter again. A week after starting my new job, I found myself laughing with my coworkers over burned muffins someone had accidentally brought to the office. We stood around the tiny break room drinking coffee from mismatched mugs while sunlight poured through old windows. Nobody cared about expensive suits or private elevators. They cared about birthdays, weekend plans, and whether the neighborhood bakery still had fresh cinnamon rolls before noon. I had almost forgotten that life could feel this uncomplicated. When work ended that evening, I stayed behind to finish the final sketches for the townhouse project. Emily stopped beside my desk and quietly placed another folder beside my drawings. "The clients loved your ideas," she said. "They specifically asked for you to handle the entire renovation." I thanked her, and after she walked away, I sat there staring at the folder with a smile I did not even realize had appeared. For the first time since leaving the penthouse, I felt proud of something that belonged entirely to me. Several miles away, Adrian Romano sat alone in his private office long after the lights in the surrounding building had gone dark. Every screen displayed security records, access logs, and archived reports from the week everything had fallen apart. He read each document slowly, comparing names, times, and electronic entries that nobody else had bothered to question. The deeper he looked, the more small inconsistencies appeared. A visitor badge issued without explanation. An elevator record that had been edited. A maintenance request that never actually existed. None of them proved anything by themselves. Together they formed a picture that refused to leave his mind. He picked up the phone and called only one person. "Bring me every original report," he said quietly. "Not the copies. The originals." His assistant hesitated for only a second before answering, "Yes, sir." Adrian ended the call and leaned back in silence. He remembered the way I had looked at him that night. Not angry. Not afraid. Simply hurt. At the time he had mistaken that expression for guilt. Now he wondered whether it had been disbelief instead. The thought settled heavily in the room. He walked toward the bookshelf and noticed something he had ignored for days. My favorite hardcover design journal was still sitting exactly where I had left it. I had never gone anywhere without it. Adrian reached for the book and opened it absent-mindedly. A folded receipt slipped onto the floor. He bent down and picked it up. It was from a neighborhood flower market dated the same afternoon I had supposedly stolen confidential files. The timestamp placed me nearly 40 minutes away from his office during the moment I had been accused. He stared at the small piece of paper for several long seconds. It was impossible to explain away. He closed his eyes briefly before whispering words that nobody else heard. What did I miss? At that same moment, I stepped outside the design studio carrying rolled blueprints beneath one arm. The summer air felt warm against my face, and the sidewalks buzzed with people finishing another ordinary day. I never noticed the familiar black sedan parked farther down the street. Inside, the same man watched quietly before making another phone call. "He has started asking questions," he said in a calm voice. There was a long pause before the reply came through the speaker. The man's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Then we move to the next step before they find each other again." He ended the call, started the engine, and disappeared into the evening traffic just as I continued walking home, completely unaware that the truth had finally begun to wake up. Saturday mornings in Brooklyn moved at a different pace than the rest of New York. The sidewalks filled with neighbors carrying reusable grocery bags, children chased pigeons through the small park across the street, and musicians played old jazz melodies that drifted through the warm summer air. I had promised myself that I would stop working for one morning and simply enjoy the neighborhood that was slowly beginning to feel like home. I carried a cup of coffee from the corner cafe and wandered through the weekend farmers market, admiring flowers I could not quite afford but still loved to look at. As I turned toward the bakery, I noticed a little boy standing alone near a bench, his eyes scanning every face that passed by. He could not have been older than 6. He held a small stuffed dinosaur tightly against his chest, trying very hard to look brave even though tears were beginning to gather in his blue eyes. I knelt beside him carefully so I would not frighten him. "Hi there," I said softly. "Are you looking for someone?" He nodded without speaking. After a long moment he whispered that he had become separated from his grandmother while chasing a balloon. I smiled and told him that balloons always seemed to think they were faster than everyone else. He laughed through his tears, and together we walked to the information booth at the center of the market. The volunteers made an announcement over the loudspeaker while I stayed beside him, talking about dinosaurs until an elderly woman came hurrying through the crowd with relief written across her face. She wrapped him in the biggest hug I had ever seen. She thanked me over and over, insisting that she could never repay my kindness. I simply smiled and told her to enjoy the rest of the morning together because those were the moments children remembered forever. They disappeared into the crowd, and I continued walking without realizing someone nearby had quietly witnessed the entire exchange. Across the city, Adrian Romano sat in a private conference room reviewing another collection of archived reports. Original paper files had replaced polished digital summaries, and for the first time in years he was reading every handwritten note instead of relying on other people's conclusions. One document immediately caught his attention. The signature approving the investigation into my alleged betrayal had been added nearly 12 hours before the complaint itself was officially filed. Adrian read the dates twice, then compared them with 3 additional reports. The sequence made no sense. Someone had prepared the outcome before the investigation had even begun. He looked up slowly at the people seated around the table. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Finally, Adrian closed the folder with quiet precision. "No one discusses this review outside this room," he said calmly. "From this moment forward, every document comes directly to me." The meeting ended without another word, but the certainty that had guided him for years was beginning to crumble beneath the weight of undeniable facts. That evening I returned to my apartment carrying fresh bread, flowers, and a sketchbook filled with new design ideas inspired by the neighborhood. As I unlocked my door, I noticed another envelope resting on the welcome mat. This one contained only a single photograph. It showed me helping the little boy earlier that morning. On the back, written in the same neat black handwriting, were 6 words that made my heartbeat stop. "Kindness makes you easy to find." I barely slept that night. The photograph stayed on my kitchen table long after midnight while the city outside slowly grew quiet. I turned it over again and again, hoping another message might somehow appear if I looked closely enough. It never did. Whoever had taken the picture wanted me to know that someone had been watching, but they also wanted me to wonder why. Fear would have been the easiest response. Instead, I locked the photograph inside the same drawer as the first note and reminded myself that panic had never solved a single problem. Sunday morning arrived with bright sunlight pouring through my apartment windows. I watered my 2 little plants, made coffee, and forced myself to keep living the life I had worked so hard to rebuild. If someone expected me to hide, they were going to be disappointed. Across Manhattan, Adrian Romano had reached the point where unanswered questions were becoming impossible to ignore. His office was covered with carefully arranged folders, security reports, visitor logs, and printed emails. Every new document seemed to remove another piece from the story he had believed without hesitation. Late that afternoon, his technology director entered carrying an old encrypted backup drive recovered from an archived security server. "We finally restored the deleted files," he said quietly. Adrian connected the drive to his computer without speaking. Several surveillance recordings appeared on the screen, including one that had been missing from every previous report. He watched the video in complete silence. The recording showed Ethan Crawford entering Adrian's private office after business hours with a maintenance employee whose identification badge had later been reported as inactive. They remained inside for 12 minutes before leaving separately. Nearly half an hour later, I appeared in the hallway carrying grocery bags, smiling politely at the concierge before taking the elevator upstairs. There was no folder in my hands. No confidential documents. No suspicious behavior. Only a woman returning home after stopping at a neighborhood market. Adrian replayed the recording twice, then enlarged the timestamp. The evidence was undeniable. The accusation against me had been built on a lie. A long silence settled over the office. His assistant remained standing near the door, waiting for instructions that did not come. Adrian finally leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, the man who trusted facts above emotions realized he had condemned the one person who had never asked him for anything except honesty. "Find Ethan," he said at last, his voice steady but quieter than usual. "Do not alert him that I know." His assistant nodded once and left immediately. Adrian remained alone, staring toward the skyline beyond the glass. He remembered the rain that night. He remembered my suitcase. Most of all, he remembered the look in my eyes when I whispered that I had done nothing wrong. He had answered certainty with silence. Now silence answered him instead. Meanwhile, I spent the afternoon helping my elderly neighbors carry a second-hand bookshelf up 2 flights of stairs. They insisted on feeding me homemade apple pie afterward, laughing when I admitted I had never been very good at refusing dessert. As the sun began to set, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer. A calm male voice spoke only one sentence before the line disconnected. "If Adrian Romano asks to see you, do not believe anything he says." The voice on the phone stayed with me long after the call ended. It was calm, almost polite, which somehow made the warning feel even heavier. I stared at my silent phone, waiting for it to ring again, but the screen remained dark. Whoever had called knew Adrian's name. They also knew enough about my life to believe we might meet again. That realization unsettled me far more than the words themselves. Monday morning arrived with clear blue skies, and I forced myself to focus on work instead of unanswered questions. The townhouse renovation had entered its busiest stage, and every hour seemed filled with measurements, fabric samples, and conversations with contractors. Around noon, the retired couple surprised everyone by bringing sandwiches for the entire office. We ate together around a large wooden table covered with blueprints, laughing as they shared stories about 50 years of marriage and the home where they had raised 3 children. Watching them reminded me that trust was not built through grand gestures. It was built through thousands of ordinary moments that slowly became a lifetime. Across Manhattan, Adrian Romano canceled 3 executive meetings for the first time in years. His priorities had shifted completely. Every available investigator was quietly tracing Ethan Crawford's recent communications, financial records, and travel history. The results arrived faster than expected. Several encrypted messages had been exchanged with outside consultants using private accounts that had never appeared on company records. One payment led to another. One hidden connection uncovered the next. The pattern became impossible to dismiss. Ethan had carefully arranged evidence, manipulated timelines, and guided every report that eventually landed on Adrian's desk. None of it had happened by accident. Adrian stood silently beside the window overlooking the city. The skyline looked exactly as it always had, yet nothing felt familiar anymore. He remembered every time I had defended someone before reaching conclusions. He remembered teasing me for believing people deserved a second chance. I had smiled and answered that the truth usually needed more patience than rumors did. Only now did he understand what I had meant. Late that afternoon he made a decision that surprised even his closest advisors. "Prepare the car," he said quietly. "I am going to Brooklyn." No elaborate security convoy followed. No public announcement was made. For the first time in a very long time, Adrian wanted answers that could not be found inside conference rooms or investigation files. Meanwhile, I finished my final client meeting just as the evening sunlight filled the office with golden light. Emily thanked me for another successful presentation and insisted I leave early for once. I smiled, gathered my sketchbook, and started the familiar walk toward my apartment. The streets were alive with families, cyclists, and people enjoying the warm weather. Halfway home I stopped at the little flower stand where I had become a regular customer. The owner handed me fresh white daisies and quietly said, "The gentleman who was here a few minutes ago asked whether you still liked these." My heart skipped once. "What gentleman?" I asked. She looked toward the busy sidewalk, searching the crowd that had already moved on. "Tall. Dark suit. Very polite. He smiled when I told him you always chose the simplest flowers." I looked around, but whoever he had been was already gone. I held the bouquet a little tighter as an unfamiliar feeling settled over me. Somewhere nearby, 2 different men were searching for me, but only one of them wanted the truth to arrive before it was too late. The next morning began with an uneasy silence that followed me from my apartment all the way to the design studio. I could not stop thinking about the florist's words or the anonymous warning from the night before. Whoever had asked about my favorite flowers knew something personal enough to make my heart race, yet had chosen to leave without speaking to me. I told myself it could have been anyone, but deep down I already knew there was only one person who had ever noticed that I always chose white daisies over expensive roses. I buried the thought beneath work. Clients were arriving, contractors needed decisions, and color samples covered every available desk. Keeping my hands busy was easier than letting my mind wander. Around lunchtime, Emily asked whether I could deliver revised drawings to a community center a few blocks away. I welcomed the excuse to step outside. The warm breeze carried the scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery, and for a little while everything felt wonderfully normal again. Children laughed in the small playground beside the building while volunteers prepared tables for an upcoming neighborhood fundraiser. I handed over the drawings and stayed for a few extra minutes helping an elderly volunteer move several folding chairs into place. She thanked me with a gentle smile and insisted that kindness always found its way back to the people who shared it. I hoped she was right. At almost the same moment, Adrian Romano stepped out of his car on the opposite side of Brooklyn. He had spent the entire morning following the trail of evidence that now pointed unmistakably toward Ethan Crawford. Every conversation, every financial transfer, every altered report painted the same picture. Someone had carefully manipulated his trust and used it to destroy mine. The realization weighed more heavily than any business crisis he had ever faced. His driver quietly informed him that my office was only a few minutes away. Adrian looked toward the street ahead but did not move. For the first time in years, certainty was replaced by hesitation. He had spent his life believing that decisive action solved every problem. Now he understood that one decision made too quickly had broken something far more valuable than any empire he controlled. Before he could take another step, his phone rang. His chief investigator spoke calmly but urgently. Ethan Crawford had resigned without notice less than an hour earlier, emptied his office, and disappeared before anyone realized he was gone. Adrian ended the call without another word. He understood immediately that someone had anticipated his discovery. Meanwhile, I finished helping at the community center and started walking back toward the studio. As I reached the corner, a black luxury sedan slowed beside the curb. The rear window lowered only halfway. I froze when I recognized the familiar profile inside. Adrian looked older than he had only a few weeks earlier, as though regret had quietly settled into every line of his face. Neither of us spoke for several long seconds while the city continued moving around us. Finally, he stepped out onto the sidewalk and stopped several feet away, leaving enough space for me to walk away if I chose. His voice remained calm, but the certainty I remembered was gone. "Claire," he said softly, "I was wrong." Before I could answer, another voice called my name from across the street. I turned to see a delivery cyclist hurrying toward me with a small sealed envelope marked only with 3 handwritten words that made the air suddenly feel much colder. "Do not trust him." My eyes moved from Adrian to the envelope in my hands and back again. It felt as though two different versions of the truth were standing in front of me, each asking to be believed first. I broke the seal slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence printed across the center. "He is telling the truth now, but someone else is still writing the ending." I read it twice before folding it carefully. Whoever had been sending the anonymous messages had changed their warning. For the first time, they were not telling me to run from Adrian. They were telling me the danger had never actually been him. I looked up and found him standing exactly where he had stopped, making no attempt to move closer. That simple choice told me more than any speech could have. Months ago he would have expected me to listen because he was Adrian Romano. Today he waited because he knew he had lost the right to demand anything. "I owe you more than an apology," he said quietly. "I owe you the truth." I took a slow breath before answering. The truth should have come before the accusation. He lowered his eyes for only a second. "You are right." There was no excuse in his voice. No attempt to defend himself. Only regret. He reached inside his jacket carefully and removed a thin folder, placing it on a nearby park bench instead of handing it directly to me. "These are copies of the original security reports and the restored recordings. You were never responsible. I know that now." I stepped toward the bench after he had moved back. Inside the folder were photographs, timestamps, and investigation notes that matched everything he had said. The pages confirmed what I had been trying to tell him from the very beginning. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I only felt tired. "Do you know what hurt the most?" I asked without looking up. "It was not leaving. It was realizing that one lie outweighed every honest day we spent together. The afternoon traffic faded into the background. Adrian answered so softly that I almost missed it. I think about that every hour. Neither of us noticed the gray sedan parked half a block away where a man quietly lowered a camera after taking several photographs of our meeting. He made another phone call and spoke only a few calm words before driving away. Somewhere else in the city, Ethan Crawford read the latest message on his phone and smiled faintly. His plan had begun to unravel, but not completely. If Adrian and I stood together again, years of careful manipulation would collapse. He intended to make certain that never happened. Back on the sidewalk, I closed the folder and handed it back. Adrian looked surprised. I believe the evidence, I said. But trust is not evidence. Trust has to be rebuilt. He nodded immediately. I know. I looked toward the familiar Brooklyn streets that had become my home. I am not coming back. He accepted those words without argument. I did not come here to ask you to return today. There was another long silence before he spoke again. I only wanted you to know that you were innocent. You deserve to hear those words from me, not from a file. For the first time since we met again, I believed every word he said. I just did not know whether believing him would be enough to change either of our futures. The days that followed felt quieter, but not because the world had changed. They felt quieter because the weight I had been carrying was finally beginning to lift. I still woke early, still walked the same 6 blocks to the design studio, and still stopped at the neighborhood cafe where the owner had memorized my order without ever asking about my past. My life had become wonderfully predictable again. I realized that peace was not something you found. It was something you protected. Emily asked me to lead a presentation for a new community housing project, one designed for families rebuilding after difficult seasons in their lives. As I spoke with the clients, I found myself talking less about furniture and paint colors and more about creating spaces where people felt safe enough to breathe. One of the volunteers smiled and quietly said, "Homes are built with trust before they are built with walls." I carried those words with me for the rest of the day. Across the city, Adrian Romano was making decisions that surprised everyone around him. He dismissed several executives who had ignored proper oversight, reorganized his entire internal investigation department, and personally apologized to employees whose reputations had been damaged by careless assumptions. Every decision cost him time, influence, and in some cases long-standing business relationships. His advisors warned him that admitting mistakes would make him appear weaker. Adrian answered with a sentence nobody expected to hear from him. The only thing weaker than admitting a mistake is pretending it never happened. Late one afternoon, he requested a meeting with the board of Romano Holdings. Instead of discussing profits, he announced sweeping reforms that placed transparency ahead of convenience. Some directors objected immediately. Others quietly resigned. Adrian accepted every consequence without hesitation. For the first time, he was protecting something more valuable than power. He was protecting the man he wanted to become. A week later, I received an unexpected invitation to a public charity exhibition featuring local architecture and neighborhood restoration projects. Our design studio had been selected to present one of the featured concepts. The event filled an old historic building with artists, architects, volunteers, and families from every corner of the city. While speaking with visitors, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the back of the room. Adrian had come alone. No entourage. No security surrounding him. He did not interrupt my conversation or ask for my attention. He simply walked through the exhibition, studied every design board carefully, and before leaving, stopped beside Emily. I watched from across the room as he quietly thanked her for believing in my talent. Then he made a generous anonymous donation to the community housing project and turned toward the exit without ever looking for recognition. Emily later handed me a handwritten note she said he had left behind. It contained only one sentence. "I finally understand that loving someone means hoping they flourish, even if they choose a different path from yours." I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my notebook. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, I smiled without sadness. Forgiveness had begun to grow inside my heart, not because the past had disappeared, but because neither of us was allowing it to decide who we would become next. 1 year passed more quietly than I ever imagined possible. The seasons changed, the little plants beside my apartment window grew taller, and the neighborhood that had once felt unfamiliar slowly became the place where I belonged. The community housing project opened its doors on a bright spring morning, and families walked through homes our team had designed with sunlight, warmth, and hope in mind. Watching children race through empty living rooms before furniture even arrived reminded me that happiness had never needed marble floors or breathtaking views. It only needed a place where people felt safe enough to dream. My career flourished in ways I had never expected. Emily promoted me to creative director, trusting me with projects that reached far beyond Brooklyn. Every accomplishment felt different because this time I knew exactly who had earned it. There were no borrowed privileges. No shadows cast by someone else's influence. Just quiet work, patient mornings, and countless ordinary days that slowly built an extraordinary life. Adrian Romano changed as well. Newspapers continued writing about the businessman whose company had undergone remarkable reforms, but the headlines never captured the real transformation. They spoke about new leadership policies and charitable investments. They never mentioned the afternoons he spent visiting community projects without cameras or the scholarships he quietly funded for young designers who could not afford college. They certainly never mentioned the Penthouse. One afternoon I received an invitation to a charity event celebrating the completion of another neighborhood restoration project. I almost declined because weekends had become precious to me, but Emily convinced me to attend. The event overlooked the Hudson River, where the evening sky reflected shades of gold across the water. I was speaking with several volunteers when I noticed Adrian standing nearby. We smiled at each other with the easy familiarity of two people who had survived the same storm from opposite sides. There was no awkwardness left between us. Only honesty. We walked toward the river together, neither of us rushing to fill the silence. Finally I asked the question I had carried for months. Do you still live there? He looked toward the Manhattan skyline before answering. No. I waited quietly. A gentle smile crossed his face. I sold the penthouse 6 months ago. I looked at him in surprise. Why? He laughed softly, almost at himself. Because I finally realized it was only a beautiful place to stand while looking at the wrong things. He reached into his jacket and handed me a small photograph instead of a business card. It showed a modest white house beside the ocean with a wide front porch, a garden filled with wildflowers, and a wooden bench facing the waves. I spend my weekends there now, he said. It reminds me that peace is much harder to lose than power if you choose the right home. I studied the picture before looking back at him. For the first time since we met, I saw not the man who ruled rooms through certainty, but the man who had learned humility through regret. I smiled and slipped the photograph into my notebook beside the handwritten note I had kept all those months. We stood together watching the sunset without promises, without demands, and without fear. Sometimes life does not give you back the chapter you lost. Sometimes it gives you two wiser people who are finally ready to write a better one. I once believed I had been banished from the place where my future lived. I was wrong. I had only been guided toward the place where I finally found myself.